Welcome to the third and final video lecture for Philosophy of Mind and our week on Materialism and Behaviorism. In this lecture, we're going to discuss Hilary Putnam's article, Brains and Behavior. Now, in the introductory chapter to this topic, we've seen that behaviorism has some serious problems. It wants to translate any and all talk of mind, like I feel, I think, I wish, I desire, to talk about behavior. So if you're angry, it is about the set of behaviors that people demonstrate when they say that they're angry. That's identical to what anger is. And there are some serious problems to that, like I said. So in this article, Hilary Putnam, who was an American philosopher a little bit later than Ryle, details some of these serious objections. And he's trying actively to persuade the reader away from behaviorism as a viable theory of mind. And he begins by talking about the beginnings of logical behaviorism, which you remember are the school of philosophical thinkers, sometimes called the Vienna Circle, who thought that we should only ever speak about what we can verify with empirical observation. And that's called verificationism. And one of the early pieces of writing that was a part of this type of thought was called the Principia Mathematica, written by Bertrand Russell and A.N. Whitehead. And they tried to reduce all of mathematics into logical concepts or relations between logical concepts. Another philosopher called Gottlob Frege attempted to create a comprehensive system of logic that could explain every single bit of the way that we think, including mathematics. So in the Principia, Russell and Whitehead defined all numbers as sets. So the set of all empty sets would be the number 0. What's an empty set? Right now we could say the King of France, because France abolished the monarchy years and years and years ago. So there is no King of France. So the set, the current King of France, is empty. It's 0. Or we can say, I struggle to think of other things that are 0. The number of songs that I've written and published is 0. So that's an empty set. For one, it's the set of all things that only have one member. So each and every one of us is in our own set because you're the only one that's you. I'm Erica Abraham, and I am in a set of 1 Erica Abrahams. So instead of these abstract entities, numbers, things that are only accessible through the mind, now we have translated them into a logical concept that is empirically observable. We have taken something from the realm of the world of the mind, not observable, private, and taken it into the public world where everybody can observe and empirically test it. Now, if we could do that for numbers, can't we do that for every concept that we have for mental states and mental behaviors? Behavior might be the wrong word there. I should just say mental states. Okay. We see sets in the world all the time. If you have 2 pencils on your desk, there's a set of 2 pencils on your desk. And even though we might not know how many pencils there are out in the world existing right now, we know that we could verify it. We could go out and count all the number of pencils in the world, and then we'd have a set of all the pencils in the world. So what about all these other mind concepts? The behaviorists said, okay, emotions, dreams, desires, your will, meaning the thing that motivates you to complete an action, your imagination, all mental events can be conceived of as logical constructions from the set of behaviors that they represent. So again, think about all the different ways you could react to being angry. You could clam up and not talk very much. You could lash out violently. You could channel it into some other activity. All of the set of behaviors that people do when they say they're angry would be the logical construction, anger. So now, anger is something that we can observe empirically. And now there's an immediate problem with this. All of us have experiences in which we are just internally experiencing something and it never makes it out into the world as behavior. So you sit every day for 10 hours a day daydreaming. You have an elaborate story, vast worlds in your imagination, but you never share it with anybody. Would we have to say that that's nothing? That mental concept or that mental world that you built up doesn't exist? Behaviorists would have to say, yes, it doesn't exist. It's nonsense. And that goes against what most people think of as mind. But that's the extreme version of behaviorism. And Putnam says that we can't just defeat the extreme version of anything. We have to look into its nuances because maybe there's some insight there. And most behaviorists by the time Putnam was writing in the 60s, I believe, had backed off from the very strong versions of behaviorism and had a more modified, weaker version. Here's the way Putnam puts the weak version of behaviorism. And this is on pages 25 and 26. Number one, that there exist entailments between mind statements and behavior statements, entailments that are not perhaps analytic in the way all bachelors are unmarried is analytic, but nevertheless follow in some sense from the meanings of mind words. And I'll call these analytic entailments. Two, that these entailments may not provide actual translation of mind talk into behavior talk, but this is only true for superficial reasons because mind talk is ambiguous and nebulous and vague, and behavior talk is relatively, at least, more specific and concrete. So what does this mean? Well, first I got to tell you what an entailment is. If we think back to the first video lecture when we talked about necessity and contingency, something that is necessary cannot happen in another way. If we didn't have DNA, we wouldn't be human beings. It's necessary to being a human being that you have DNA. Something that's contingent could or could not have happened. So a logical entailment is something that refers to things that are necessary. They must happen. If one thing exists, the other thing exists as well. Or if one thing is true, it logically necessarily follows that some second thing is true. So if you're a behaviorist who embraces this weak version of behaviorism, you're saying that everything you talk about when you talk about mind statements, I'm angry, I'm in pain, I desire food, there's a necessary behavior that is attached to it. It might not be identical to it, but the two come together. One of them never happens without the other. They're entailed. And these weaker version of behavioralists say the only reason that we can't do it easily is because mind talk is so frou-frou and vague, and it's a lot less specific than behavior talk because we can't observe it uniformly. Now, Putnam goes about arguing against this in a couple different ways. First, he talks about cluster concepts and how they cannot be explained completely by behavior alone. What's a cluster concept? Well, a lot of things have a one-to-one this is its definition and this is the thing. Like the example that Putnam uses is the color red. All you have to do is point to something that's red and say, this is red. There are other more complicated definitions, but red is a color and that's all it is. Whereas something like pain isn't easily definable. You can't just point to it. There are many different types of pains. There are many different reasons pain happens. And there are many different situations and environments and events in the world in which pain occurs. That's why it's a cluster concept. There are a lot of different ways to define the same thing. Whereas you can say that a cube has 6 sides, you have to say pain is a feeling that happens for reason 1, reason 2, reason 3, and it happens in context 1 and 2 and 3 and so on. But we do know when we're in pain. And it's a central example for many different philosophical theories because it seems special above and apart from other mental states because you can never be wrong about it. Even if you are a habitual liar, or you are a person that's prone to hallucinating or having delusions, if you think you're in pain, then you're in pain. It can even be a phantom pain. Say you have no damage to your body, but you still have pain. It still exists. You're still in pain. You're still in that mental state, regardless of the surrounding circumstances, and we know it immediately. But okay, the behaviorist is going to say that pain is a cluster concept in the sense that every single behavior that we can list that is associated with pain is part of the pain cluster concept. But that's not how Putnam is going to define it. He's going to eventually claim that it depends on the cause. There is a type of cause that creates the cluster of pain, speech, and behavior. And to make this clear, he's going to use another example, the definitions of diseases. So if you're not familiar, polio is a disease that can cause a variety of symptoms. Some people that get polio don't show any symptoms at all, a little bit like coronavirus. Some people have flu-like symptoms, also like coronavirus, where in some small percentage of people that have polio get it way worse. They develop meningitis and they develop paralysis. If you've ever heard of an iron lung, some polio patients who've advanced this far have to be put into an iron lung or the pressure breathes for them because their lungs are paralyzed. There's even something called the post-polio syndrome where decades after you've had polio, you can have some paralysis in your body. Now, the virus that causes polio virus, was discovered in 1909, but people had been having polio, the disease, for thousands of years before that, maybe even in prehistory, meaning pre the written word. Now, doctors pre-1909 still diagnosed people with polio, even though they didn't know the virus was the cause. So now we go post-1909, we discover the virus, and we can say that some of those doctors' diagnoses were wrong. The patients who'd presented themselves to the doctors might have had similar symptoms, but the cause was different. Their paralysis was caused by a different virus or something else altogether, a mechanical problem in their brain. So we look back and we say, some of those doctors' diagnoses were wrong. Now we've discovered the cause of polio, and it's this virus. From now on, the only way that you'll be diagnosed with polio is if we test for this virus and it's in your bloodstream. Behaviorists would say that that story is wrong. Instead, they'd say the meaning of the word polio has changed. It used to mean whoever had this cluster of symptoms, and now it means whoever has this cluster of symptoms and you do a physical test in the behavioral world and you find the virus. So they'd say that the pre-1909 doctors were absolutely right whenever they diagnosed polio, and not that they were incorrect. But Putnam says that's obviously not true. They were just incorrect some of the time because they had no access to testing for viruses or not. And we commonly and routinely understand that something causes a disease when someone has it. It might be a genetic cause, it might be an environmental cause, but it isn't just a way of talking about clusters of symptoms. When we say that something is a particular disease, we mean that it has a particular cause. And in parallel, Putnam talks about MS or multiple sclerosis, because now we diagnose people as having multiple sclerosis through excuse me, I don't know why I can't say that properly, through clusters of symptoms. People see a certain set of symptoms and we give them tests and we can observe lesions on their neurons, perhaps. I'm not a medical expert, but I know the myelin sheath wears away in MS patients. And if in the future we figure out that there's a virus that causes MS, then we can say that some of the people that have been diagnosed with MS don't actually have it. Their symptoms are caused by something else. And thus, Putnam tells us that the cause of a disease isn't constructed out of the behaviors that surround it. It's a thing in and of itself that causes those behaviors. And the same is true for pain and all other mental concepts. Something causes that pain. It's not a concept that's constructed out of the behaviors of pain. It's not created by the way we display pain to other people. And now is the second way that Putnam attacks behaviorism, with a set of science fiction thought experiments. And philosophers love their thought experiments to try and get at the logical, conceptual underpinnings of the theories that we argue. Thought experiments might be implausible, but they always need to be possible because we're pushing our theories to their absolute boundaries. What's possible if you believe X? And is it no longer possible if you believe Y? Now, this is the beginning of a concept we're going to talk a lot about when we talk about functionalism called multiple realizability. We've already started thinking about it. We've talked about how we think creatures other than human beings feel pain sometimes. And when we say that our pets are in pain, we are functionally saying that they are in a state that's similar to us when we are in pain. And that's all multiple realizability is. The same thing can happen multiply in different kinds of creatures. Pain can happen in cats, in dogs, in kangaroos, in people, and in a possible alien from Alpha Centauri. It doesn't just happen in human beings. Now, Putnam asks us to imagine a race called the Super Spartans. If you don't know Spartans, they were an ancient, I'm going to say Greek, but they might have been Roman. I'm not too up on the history of that part of the world. The movie 300 was about Spartans. And the Spartans were known for having a lot of self-discipline and living with only the bare necessities, being stoic. Now, these super Spartans could be from another planet. They could be human. They could have human DNA. Say we send out a ship and they settle on a different planet and we're apart for thousands and thousands of years, we can imagine that they have a different set of behaviors to the human beings that stayed on Earth. Or they can be a different kind of life altogether. No DNA. We can't even imagine what it is yet. But over time, they've developed a set of moral values, and they say you're only a good person if you don't display your pain. You can talk about it. You can say, hey, I'm in pain, but you can't wince. You can't cry. You can only calmly talk about it. And Putnam goes through different types of cases, making their stoic reaction to pain more and more strict over time to try and prove that behaviorists are incorrect. Okay, so we've just diverged from this race of super Spartans. They've only been separate from other kinds of human beings for 10 or 15 generations. So that means that when you're born into this super Spartan society, you have to learn how to repress your pain reactions. You're a young kid and you cry when something hurts. The behaviorist would say that this is proof enough to show that the entire species or group of people feel pain. That behavior is enough to be part of the pain cluster concept and also recognizing that they train it out of themselves. But now Putnam tells us to imagine someone who has been practicing this stoicism and non-reaction to pain for millions of years, to the point where they've actually changed their DNA or their biological structure, and they're born knowing how to repress their reactions to pain. They still feel pain, they still talk about pain, but they never ever show it on their face or in their body. Behaviorists would have to say that this species or society does not experience pain, and that seems absurd to us. And now we can even imagine someone a step further. Not only can they not physically react to pain, they're not even allowed to talk about it. So they have some sort of internal black box workings. They feel pain, but they'll never talk about it and they'll never show it. Behaviorists, again, would have to say, okay, there's no way that this species or society feels pain, because pain is the set of behaviors. So Putnam tells us that we invent a machine that reads brainwaves. And there is a spike in human beings' brainwaves whenever they feel pain. And maybe there's an identical one in this alien society of super Spartans. The behaviorists object and they say, well, how can we possibly know that they're the same as us? Just because they have a similar brainwave doesn't mean that they're feeling pain. And then Putnam responds and says, okay, that's fine. What if we invent a machine that can actually translate our thoughts into language? For us, it's English. For aliens, it's their language. But we point the beam at their head, and then the computer reads out whatever it is that they're thinking. Can you imagine that? That would make minds no longer private, and that would change the nature of all of these discussions. You could record your dreams because this machine could translate it into words. You could point it at somebody and know their innermost thoughts, even if they don't want to share it with you. Now, how could the behaviorist possibly counter this and say, no, this super Spartan race who never shows pain on their face or body and never talks about pain still doesn't have pain, even though this technology that works, it's not just random, it's not just accidental. We can point it at their brains and know what they're thinking. It says, I'm feeling pain, even though they'll never say it or show it. The behaviorist says, no, there's still no pain in that species, but most people think that that's absolutely ridiculous. There's a cause. There's something that's happening internally without any external behavior. Now, these two branches of arguments against behaviorist theory can be boiled down into two quick overviews. Behaviorists often argue that the meanings of words have changed. So that's like the definition of polio or multiple sclerosis, or saying that cats feel pain. It's a different thing. Yes, they feel something, but it's not pain as we feel pain as human beings. The definition has changed as we change species. Or the behaviorist can say that something is unverifiable. We can't be inside someone's mind, so we can't empirically observe it. So as materialists, we can't say that it's real. It's not able to be empirically tested. But Putnam says neither of those work. He gives a thought experiment about saying, okay, every single physical object in the universe has doubled in size overnight. The behaviorists put this up as a nonsense thought experiment because, yes, it is literally possible that this could happen due to some unknown mechanism. But the behaviorists say we'd never know because everything would be relatively the same size and the same distance away from one another. Distance is relative. We define distance as the space between objects. And if the relative space between objects stays the same, a foot is still going to seem like a foot to us. A yard is still going to seem like a yard to us. But Putnam says no, that even this standard bearer that's supposed to show why verifiability is so important to talking about meaning and talking about mind, scientists would figure it out if only the sizes changed and all of our physical constants stayed the same, like gravity and the speed of light. Things would drastically change. We'd be able to verify it. And this is basically the crux of this particular argument against verifiability. If you're a real empiricist, just because we don't understand something now, including internal experience like mind, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. That doesn't mean it's not verifiable. It just means we can't understand it yet. We might be wrong. The Spartans might be lying to us even when we develop our mind-reading machine. But all that we can actually verify is what's available to us in the moment. We have to take what data we have and be careful to construct our theories only on that data. So Putnam's arguing that behaviorists are saying mind is unverifiable and they just don't know if that's the case. Just because we can't verify it yet, again, doesn't mean we can't discover it later. So now we think we have two pretty knocked down arguments against behaviorism from Putnam. And we have this intriguing concept of verifiability, or multiple realizability that we will talk about soon again. Please ask questions or make comments either in email or here, or we can set up a meeting in Zoom, and I will see you for our next topic.